Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs and share our experience to hopefully help you have your best game.
Hello, Jeremy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. How are you today?
Perfect. Doing well. How are you?
I am pretty well. Pretty well, actually.
Good.
I have an idea, from when I'm there in a couple weeks.
Okay.
When I'm there in a couple weeks, I have a pair of little lapel clip mics that I can record just directly into my computer. So we could actually sit in the same room if you had time, and we could record an episode.
That would be great. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, that would be cool. I figured, since we're focusing on the pod, not the YouTube, I figured that wouldn't make a difference. So cool. I'll actually do that in person. I've gotten some good feedback from folks, people I know, but also like mystery people on the internet who are like, "Hey, I'm really glad the show's back. You guys have a good vibe, good connection, things like that." So I was like, "Great. Hope we're doing some good for people."
I've liked seeing on the Discord the people that with the episode suggestions and different things.
Yeah, that'll be helpful. So today we're going to talk about campaign planning.
Yes.
And creeping there in the background.
Yep.
We're going to talk about campaign planning, your request, and something that I'm actually doing right now. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. When you say campaign planning, not what are you thinking? What are you thinking? Let's nail down some definitions. What do you mean?
Yeah. So just to kind of recap the definition that I gave the last time we talked about this general idea, campaign is a large group of adventures that you're doing in a row. So it's basically more of a overarching story that you want to tell with your players. So that could be many, many sessions with several different adventures in the middle that end up at some ending point. And that could be a published campaign that you play through. That could be a large group of published adventures that you then string together into a campaign, or it could be something completely that you create yourself with each session being planned out by the GM.
Right. Okay, cool. So there's our definition. Love it. So taking a fiction property, you could say that, the original Star Wars trilogy would be a campaign.
Right.
And each of the, movies are a little tough, I guess. Maybe you say actually the Dominion War in Deep Space Nine, the latter half of the Deep Space Nine seasons, you could say that was an overarching campaign in which each of the episodes forms an adventure. And in that case, there's a combination between, call them like meta-plot focused episodes, like the overarching campaign story, and then also more episodic ones. So you kind of go back and forth. But yeah, it is a sequence. It unfolds over time, and it could have, I think in most cases, campaigns, either they start explicitly with an overarching meta-plot or they build one over time. But we're talking about, and moving away from the terms I've been using here in the last week and some as I've been working on my campaign planning, I'll just go with the conventional terms. Campaign, you defined that. And an adventure is then a definable plot or subplot that has a beginning, middle, and end, I would hope, that sits within the campaign. And that could be one session with your group, or it could take a couple of sessions, but that there's clearly a definable beginning to that adventure and end to that adventure, and it sits within the campaign.
Yep, that's exactly how I've been thinking about it as well.
Perfect. Okay, so we're totally on the same page, and for those of you listening, you know what page we're on now. So how do we want to approach this? You said, well, how do you go about planning a campaign? Is that where we're starting?
Yeah, and that's where I think that it's pretty basic when you're doing a published campaign. So, like in the Traveler universe, they have several published campaigns where it's a book where it has very long like descriptions of this, and so do 2D20 systems have published campaigns as well, and so does Dungeons and Dragons and every other RPG out there.
Yeah, all the 5e
think,
books like Rime of the Frost Maiden and Princes of the Apocalypse, I would consider each of those to be a campaign because there are multiple sub-adventures, and given like D&D's focus on leveling, there is a progression that is mechanical, that's related to the character, which is also, it parallels and connects to the story.
Right. And that's where I think, for at least in my case and most of my friends who, when they were new GMs, the thing that they have the biggest difficulty with is either trying to sit down to plan out a true campaign with people, or how to make that transition from, okay, I've opened with an adventure like High and Dry, and now I'm trying to turn this into an actual campaign where we continue further without just following published adventure after published adventure after published adventure, and then trying to turn that into a campaign. Now, there is some benefit in like how to string those together, but people want to sit down and go, okay, now, but I want to make my campaign, something that I have built myself, and planning that out. What stages do you go through in making that plan?
Yeah, that is a challenge, and sometimes you have that great moment where you said, "Hey, I'd like to run this adventure for this game," and you do for your friends, and they're like, "That's really cool," and that moment, everyone's sitting around the table, and the unspoken that may become the spoken comment is, "We want more," and you want more as a GM, so you're like, "All right, now I need to plan something." I think the big question, and it's in a way, I think it's kind of a false question, but it is absolutely worth asking, is this going to be a more of a, call it like a plot-driven campaign, or is it going to be more sandboxy? And so I think that's your first question. Like when you look at, and this is whether you're sitting down just like imagining, what kind of, I want to run, I've got an idea for a story, or it's something that evolves out of, hey, let's try this game out, and everyone really digs it, and they dig their characters, and they want more. Is it going to be more of a, like I said, a plot driven? That is, you as the GM are going to some degree or another, sketch out the beginning, middle, and end of the whole thing, or at least have some idea as to like the vector, like where is it going, and how should it feel, and what kinds of things are going to happen along the way. Not sure where it's going to end, but are you? And I'm defining that as your plot driven campaign, or are you intending to make it a sandbox wherein I would assume you would like throw things at your players, or as your players, make decisions and make allies and make enemies and do things and stuff like that, then you get inspired and come up with ideas. So I think that's the first fork in the road that you need to answer.
Yeah, and that's where I've luckily played different campaigns that have been in both of those situations, where my very first campaign ever, the GM was like, this is going to be the start. Here's the defined middle, and here's kind of the end game for everybody. He had that planned out at the beginning of the campaign. Everything in between was kind of up to us and where we went with it. But he kind of had these set places where we would end up as we went through. But the game I've been playing with my solo GM and I for forever, it's been completely open world. He's like, here's the starting adventure, and there's a million places you could go with this, and we'll just build a story as we go through it. And I think, in my experience, it's really easy for people, if they're going to do a story-driven campaign, to come up with like, here's where we're going to start and here's where I want to end. How do we link those together? And I think sandbox campaigns are just completely intimidating for most new GMs, because the idea of just letting people make a decision is very difficult.
Here's the tough thing, is that like I'm actually not a fan, and I've counseled this to GMs before, like, if you have an idea for a story driven or plot driven, and let's just use that as those are interchangeable. If you have an idea for a campaign like that, I would focus more on the beginning and the initial steps to provide a general direction, and lean more on what kinds of things. Hey, I have this idea, and I really think it would be cool to have characters that have these kinds of experiences, and we have these kinds of places and these kinds of interactions. Not so much, and this is how I would like it to end. Because a really good friend of mine, really creative guy. He had, this was so long ago. He ran, I think it was, we were using Pathfinder First Edition, so this was a while ago. He wanted to run this campaign. He had this whole idea, and it was this whole world that he came up with. And it was like magic infusing everything and all kinds of weirdness and stuff like that. And the trouble was, it was cool, but his idea of how the story, and here comes the dirty word, should proceed was so clear to him that as time passed, like, think of it this way. Think of it like like looking at a silhouette of a tree. A silhouette of a tree that has like branches going in all directions. The trunk, it starts, and then the thing just spreads out in all directions. Your players, unless they are totally happy with your vision and just want to be told, all right, the room is 20 feet by 30 feet and appears completely, boring or whatever, there's no mimic in the room or something like that. Unless your players are happy with that, just being told, this is what, here, I'm going to throw a challenge in your face. It's going to be very explicit. It's going to be impossible to miss, and you're going to chew on it. And then next, I'm going to throw another one on you. You're going to chew. Unless you have players who are perfectly happy with that, your players are going to branch out. And so over time, the problem is you want to then cinch them up on the other end. Does that make sense? Like, you want to take all those branches and tie them back together. But if your players have agency, if you respect that your players are contributing to and fleshing out the story as well, you can't do that. And I remember actually a couple of us, I remember I was, talked to him, we're just like, kind of feel like we're being railroaded, and it was like, and I remember him saying, and he was like, yeah, but I know how the story's supposed to go. And I was like, but then you don't need us.
Right. That's been the thing that luckily I have not run into this very often outside of like one shots where of course it's railroaded because you're doing it in one session, but railroading, I think, number one, some players actually don't dislike railroading. It just depends on the situation. But if it's something like that, where there are these defined sections, telling your players that up front, like my first campaign ever that was very, like, I don't want to say it was railroady, it was very open-ended, but we knew where we were going to end up kind of at the end. How we managed that was our GM told us at the very beginning, like, you are all brought together because there is this problem. None of you are ready to handle that problem yet. You all have a lot of growth to go through in order to get to that point, which we knew kind of going into the story, like, oh yeah, like, we're just kind of nobodies coming off the street and we're going to go rescue the kingdom. That wasn't really the goal. That was just something that he introduced in the background. Well, by the end of the campaign, it was like, no, we can handle that. We'll go deal with that problem. And with the more sandbox campaigns, I tend to like them a little bit better because then it's like, there isn't an ending. I don't know when this will end until you all decide that we've reached an ending as players. Now, of course, GMs will probably, in my experience, get bored eventually of running the same campaign all the time, and you need a break. And one of the things I actually heard while watching one of Seth Surkowski's videos was GMs be okay with hanging something up. Like, if you never come back to it, that's okay, because clearly no one wants to come back to it. Yeah. But if you put it up for a little while and then after a few months, your players are like, hey, I really want to go back and revisit that campaign we were doing. Yeah, you can do it's that. Great news, because that means that they're interested in this campaign that you've been playing.
So back to your point about the, actually before that, a couple of things. So my suggestion, at least, is if you are planning a campaign as a GM, to be mindful of how much you are okay with the players fleshing it out alongside you. And if you're really not, you're not planning a campaign, you're trying to write a book.
Right.
And you should just go write a book. don't expect, unless you have a group of players who absolutely want to just, this is going to sound snarky, like be told what to do. If you don't have that, then just accept, like, okay, I have this idea for this wackadoo world or whatever, and I'm not interested in sharing that world. That is its construction and evolution with others. And if you're not, just be honest with yourself and don't do it. Back to your comment about sandboxes being intimidating. They are. And I actually don't think, I think the true sandbox, much like the state of nature, is theoretical.
Right.
You're not going to have a GM who just, everyone sits down, they have their characters, the GM leans back and goes, what do you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there has to be, you have no plot without an instigating event or pressure or problem. You have no story. And the trouble also with the idea of a true sandbox is that unless you're saying, like, your characters were transported here from nowhere and you know nothing about anything, you were just magically put here, there's a tremendous amount of background knowledge that your players need in order to be able to inhabit their characters who inhabit that world. And they're from the whatever valley and they know what's up there. In order for them to take the ball and run with it, I just don't. So it's somewhere like the pure railroad, I think, is no fun. Because also it puts a tremendous burden on you, the GM. Like, you always have to have all the answers of what is going to happen and why it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. That's a ridiculous burden you put on yourself. Your players are creative too. Leverage that. Require that. But on the other hand, this perfect passivity of the world doesn't do anything until you poke it with a stick.
Right.
And the silly thing is that, so it's got to be somewhere in between. And depending on where your comfort level is and where their comfort level is, you find some kind of a balance. I don't think that it's necessary in having a campaign to say to yourself, the same degree of sandbox versus plot is going to be the same the whole time.
Right.
You could have an adventure within a campaign that is more sandboxy because the players know more about the world or are just more interested in that kind of. You could have one that, as you're thinking, like, all right, if my campaign is made up of 4 acts and each act has a couple of adventures within it, the transition from Act 1 to Act 2, when I want the players to suddenly realize that something's rotten in Denmark, like, I need to guide them a little bit there. So it's okay to, much like when you're driving, sometimes you press the gas harder and sometimes you let off. I think that's a thing to keep in mind before you even nail down, like, what's going on in the campaign.
Right. And one of the other big things I've noticed playing in other people's games, and I'm trying to do this in what I'm starting, is letting the players, like, it's sandbox in the direction you can go. But once you've decided to follow that compass point, there will be logical conclusions to that. So as an example, if they choose if they had chosen in this High and Dry campaign to just shoot up the downport on Walston, that would have, okay,
bad
well,
idea.
Guess what? Now you're all getting arrested, right, and we're playing a prison escape campaign. Right. Like, those are the kind of things that will follow from your decisions. And I think that is the better way to look at it, in my experience, and from what I've learned from other people in running games, that you are allowed as a GM to say,
of course you are.
No, because of what you've done, you now have to deal with this. And that can be just as fun as knowing, like, as a player being like, I have complete, like, decision-making abilities. Yes, but there are repercussions to that. And that could be beneficial or negative.
Yeah.
But really, even the negative, like, repercussions in a game can actually be beneficial because they tell a better story.
Yeah.
It just depends on how your players react to the situation.
And what they do. And I mean, also how they how they as players view like what's the opportunity I have here with this character in this story, and am I like I think a lot of people, unfortunately, and this is just an aside, they get too used to the idea of the player is this like kind of ego avatar for me, and I want to win, and I want to be cool, and I want to, and you don't recognize that like sometimes having your character fall flat on its face, or having your character fail, or even having your character die is actually way more interesting and cool within the story than your character is always the triumphant badass who always overcomes everything and, you know, walks slow motion away from the castle and throws a Zippo lighter over his shoulder for the giant Michael Bay fuel air explosion. Like that kind of crap. That's just, anyway. So let me throw this at you because I'm in the middle of planning a campaign right now for Star Trek Adventure. So we started off, we've played 3 episodes because I'm using the cinematic language. We've played 3 episodes so far. 2 of them were, I'd say, like classic Star Trekian. And one of them is,
okay.
And they were, by the way, they were both published adventures that I got from Modiphius's adventure book. So the first one had the crew, or the PCs rather, investigating like a Federation science outpost that had lost communication with higher headquarters. So they have to go there and solve a problem. Okay, like totally felt like an episode. The next one, they were called to this neutral world because the campaign takes place right before the Dominion War breaks out. And they were initially in the Alpha Quadrant. If you're not familiar with any of this and listening, you should watch Deep Space Nine because it's a great series. And they were called to assist like a medical emergency on a neutral world. And the Federation is like, look, anytime a neutral or unaligned world calls for help, we're going there because we want to make allies. So that one felt very Star Trekian. The third one, and this was where I kind of put my foot on the gas a little bit, and I chose the lane we were going to be in. I had the chief medical officer murdered on the ship in a holodeck accident. And long story short, of course, the PCs have to investigate because they're like the science officer and now the acting medical officer and the security chief. They're, trying to figure out what's going on. Long story short, the captain is a changeling. The captain has been replaced. The captain and the chief medical officer went off to some strategic briefing conference thing. They were gone for the second episode. They come back, a couple weeks pass, and in the background, the chief medical officer started to suspect that something was odd about the captain. She had been replaced by a changeling. And so she offed him to not get discovered. And then they discover this, and there's this whole rigmarole with like the changeling trying to blow up the ship with all kinds of malware programmed into the computer. And so they have to save the ship. They actually ended up capturing the changeling, and which is not something that's ever mentioned in, it doesn't have, so these are the kinds of cool things you can have happen like in the background in an existing IP. But anyway, so now I gave the players a choice. I said, listen, we can go one of 2 ways. And in game, the admiral, some Starfleet intelligence admiral who shows up in another ship that's much bigger than theirs and like takes custody of everything. It's like internal affairs shows up and like, we're in charge. They're out in like deep space. They're not even brought back to a port. Like everyone on the ship is being debriefed and like, sworn to secrecy and all this stuff. So I gave the players and the characters a choice. What do you want to do next? Starfleet Intelligence is offering you an opportunity to like join the intelligence war, as it were. Or we'll send you as far away from this stuff as possible and you'll be sworn to secrecy. They actually chose the latter because they wanted to stick with, they wanted to stick with a more traditional, more often than not episodic Star Trekian kind of campaign. I said, okay, cool. So Modiphius several years ago put out this really excellent campaign book called The Shackleton Expanse. It's like 300 pages long, and it's this giant unexplored area of space on the other side of Klingon and Romulan territory. And the book has a ton of content in it. It has a ton of adventures. It has a whole campaign made up of like 10 different, if you were to run all of it, it's massive. So they decided they wanted to do that. So now what I have been doing is taking that existing content and deciding which of it I would like to run and in what order, so that I have a combination of episodic episodes, like standalone Star Trek-y stuff, and that the overarching campaign story develops over time. What I didn't want to do is have a campaign whose plot has one plot in it. Like, it is this campaign, and that's it. And everything else comes to a screeching halt. Like, nor did I just want purely episodic. So what I'm in the process of doing right now is I'm taking the campaign guide, the Shackleton Expanse campaign guide, and I'm going through it, and I have already decided like which of the campaign adventures I'm going to run. And there's already a sequence, obviously, because they build on each other, but some of them are less important than others, and some of them are just, there are other ships that are assigned to this area, so I'm going to offshore some of that activity to those other ships, so that when their ship, the player ship, comes back to Starbase 364 and they get briefings from other captains, it'll make the world feel more like it's breathing, that they're not the only actor in the world. The USS Bellerophon went to like XYZ Prime and had this experience, and they came back. I'm going to do that to some of the adventures that I don't want to run.
Right.
And then I have some of these more episodic ones that fit into it. Like, I am going to account for when the Khitomer Accords are kicked aside and the Klingons and the Federation have a short, violent war. Well, Starbase 364 in the Shackleton Expanse is jointly staffed by Klingons and Federation. So that stuff's going to hit the fan. And that's going to get fly in the face of them focusing on this developing campaign overarching story. So back to the idea of like more sandboxy, less sandboxy. Overall, this campaign will be less sandboxy because I have a sequence. Within each, it'll be your approach, where it's like, you've got to make the decisions, and I'm going to feed this stuff to you, but you've got to figure out how to move through each. It's almost like a string of spheres, and each of the spheres is an episode, and they can ping pong around inside as they wish. And how I move to the next sphere in the sequence, because the story does have a logical sequence that will build, and they build knowledge of what's going on in this area of space so they can understand the overarching story. Like, I will have to obviously do some work, depending on what the players do, to reconcile that sequence to keep it moving. But that, I think, strikes a nice balance between those two. But here's my bit of advice when it comes to this kind of thing, is that I go from big to small. That is, here's the campaign. I now have the 11 episodes that are going to make up this campaign. They're all in the book. I've just chosen which ones I want, and I've sequenced them out, balancing between the episodic ones and the campaign ones. And then I have an outline. I have an outline of the 11 episodes that will make up the whole campaign. Now what I can do is start working through each to familiarize myself with all the details of each, and building references and things that I can use at the table to make running it easy. So like I said, my campaign planning overall tends to be from big to small. Once I have the big picture idea, if I sequence out the beginning, middle, and end, I can then plug in the pieces, and then I shrink down to the tactical level, the adventure, the episode level next.
That makes sense. I think with mine, I was just going to say, I think I'm going to try to run as many of the March's adventures as my players seem interested in, just like building together, because I think they connect together really well. I've been going back and forth on what order I want to do them in, but I think that they work as a good, like, here is an intro to Traveler. You're going to see all of like the major options, and I'm looking at the skill packages and trying to kind of work in the different, like, what those could be as you go through, and like hooks for things that you could do after we're done with this. And then I'm basically going to go, okay, like, your ship's ready. Which direction are you thinking about going? And that will help me kind of go like, okay, to build my 11 adventures of what this is going to end up being, Okay, well, is it going to be okay, now you're drawn back into the Navy because a bunch of you are in the Navy or the Scout Force or whatever? Is this now you're going to go off and you've done ground combat? You want to be in like a mercenary campaign? Or is this something that now you've kind of gotten a taste of what science is like and go do exploration and scientific study and go from there?
That's a smart approach, particular to Traveler, but there's a universal, truth you can tease out of that. And that is that you're starting a campaign in a system, but more importantly, a setting with which you have little familiarity. And your players have little familiarity. And what you are doing by giving them these episodic adventures that all take place in the same general area of space. And by the way, one thing you will need to do with that, though, is you're more than likely going to have to change the worlds where some of those things take place, because some of them are really like weeks, months from one another in terms of jump space. I'll give you some advice on that, but I mean, I could do that offline. But yeah, by giving them a series of different all very Traveler-esque sort of adventures, but they're in the same general region of space, familiarizes your players with the game and their characters and all that stuff. But or maybe even more importantly, it familiarizes with them with a piece of the canon, a piece of the setting. So as they become more familiar with like the idea of the Navy and the Scout Service and all those kinds of things, but they also will get familiar with a piece of the Spinward Marches, which will then enable them, when you finish with these, if you don't have like a formal campaign that Mongoose, they have several of those. If you decide to be like, okay, let's wing it. I'm going to start coming up with my own stuff. Your players will be in a much better position to give you the information you need to be like, oh, we want to run some hey, we heard there's a mercenary company hiring people for this, that, or the other. Yeah, all right, it seems like it pays pretty well. The insurance policy is pretty good too. We'll do that. All right. Because now they understand that like mercenaries that's all just part of things. Like lots of independent worlds hire mercenaries to come in and, provide security or fight their little wars and things like that. Okay, we can do that because your players now have that knowledge of the setting and specific to that part of the setting. That's really smart. And that's where, you can go from an episodic approach to something that over time develops into, and that's something that to remember, like, you can start off intending to just run a few or be episodic, and then organically it evolves into something more coherent. Because your creative juices get, stirred and replenished, and so do those of your players.
Yeah, I agree with the spacing. I think I found a way to possibly work all 5 of them into where it's kind of like you're working your way towards a certain direction to hit all of them. But there's one that's like really out of the way. And I'm like, well, I can do it here, but I'm not sure if that's how I want to. But I might just skip that one and say, here are the 4 that they actually work directly, from place to place, that it'll work out for what they want. But yeah, we'll see. That's kind of where I am. I don't want to go too much into like building a campaign yet, because I don't think I know Traveler well enough that unless I was picking up one of their published campaigns, like the Fifth Frontier War, I don't think I would be able to run it without that, because I don't have enough experience yet.
Here's one bit of advice that is Traveler specific. Traveler can be very overwhelming. And it wasn't until, actually, it's crazy. It's not until Mongoose came out with the Third Imperium book, which only came out like 2 years ago or something. It wasn't until I got that and read that it suddenly, after 40 years of knowing about and reading about and hearing again playing Traveler, I finally realized like it is so huge and it is so big and I don't need to touch all of it. So it is huge and it can be intimidating in that respect. But if you narrow your focus to like 1 or 2 subsectors of space in the Spinward Marches, you'll do 2 things. You'll help yourself build up knowledge of that space where your characters are really going to do their thing. And it'll also enable your players rather, to build their own capacity of knowledge so that they can help you come up with stories and adventures that are fun for everybody. Yeah, so it's back to the idea of planning a campaign. I think that, like I said, I always go big picture to little picture. If I have an idea of like an overarching campaign, sometimes I have that little idea like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have, wouldn't it be cool if the player characters were a team of mercenaries and they build a company of mercenaries, and then over time that's cool. But the challenge to that is, what if your players decide that they don't want to do that 2 months into the game? Suddenly they don't have an idea of building a mercenary company that becomes like a mercenary army because you had this great idea. That would be so cool. So yeah, it's tough. And you can't hold on to your big picture ideas too tightly.
Right.
Because your players might even come up with stuff that's cooler and more interesting than what you had thought of initially.
Yeah, and that's where I really like the idea of big picture to small picture, because when you're planning a campaign, at least I think for what I'm going to be doing, that the best thing to do would be like, okay, here's the general gist of like, we're going to be this area or this time period, like you've talked about doing in the past with different things. Like, we're only going to cover this section of like published story, but then going from there, like, okay, well, with that, what adventures do we want to do within there? Like, are they like leaning more towards like a spy or a mercenary or something like that you can then build out from? And then you get into the individual, like, okay, here's the prep we need for this session to start that. And then, okay, based on the decisions you made, that's going to carry into the next and the next and the next.
Yeah, the focus is less on here is the story that is going to unfold over time, and more, these are the kinds of activities, and this is the kind of tone and the vibe. These are the kinds of experiences that the players want to have, that you're interested in coming up with. I also think that the best real campaigns, the ones that last, are the ones that happen naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can plan, and I've done this so many times. Oh, I'm going to do it, it's going to, and then it never works out. And then you're all disappointed, you get all emo and stuff like that. And, you're annoyed. I put in all this work and it doesn't matter. And the best campaign I ever ran, hands down, was Pathfinder Kingmaker, using Pathfinder's first edition rules. We played that in 3 blocks, our group, over time. And what I mean by blocks is like, we played it for like, I think about 6 months or 8 months, and then took a couple months off because one of the guys' work schedules changed. Then we had that happen again. But we played that for like 2.5 years. Now, it was a published campaign, but we built so much more into it because it was serendipitous. We all had that moment. We were like, this is really cool. And we kept having that moment. So we just kept naturally pouring into it. And unfortunately, I think the idea of the grand, sweeping, awesome D&D 20-level campaign is like, yeah, that's great, but that's really going to happen like never. You can't force it. And I think you just have to accept that. So even if you are, big picture to little picture, or you have a book like Secrets of the Ancients, which is like a murder weapon that Mongoose puts out of a campaign, you have to accept that, like Seth said, you know what, this might just gas out.
Right.
Like what I'm doing with Star Trek Adventures is, I hope to be done with this by my series. I hope to be done with this series by the end of this calendar year. I hope to be done with it by the time we break for Christmas. And I'm already like in my head saying I'd like to run something different starting in January. And if that doesn't happen, if everyone's so jazzed for Star Trek, well, we'll keep going with it. But I think it's actually better there's a piece, like plan a real-time end, and think about what you're going to run next.
Right. And that's what, we'll see. That's where I've so far gotten one of these big Traveler games a month. So hopefully that's not the way it's going to continue, but we'll see. And that's where, I have a planned idea for when the actual like written adventures will end. And then after that, if they want to change and do Conan or continue to do Traveler, but not with these characters, because we messed the character creation way up and we can go back and fix that, or do something else. That's kind of the plan.
All right. I think you're doing the right thing. And we will follow up with how this works out and how the next session, and whether they end up with the ship or they end up stuck in a volcano. We will do that next.
Yes. I think it'll be one more week of recording and then, yes.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes.